Welcome to the Jesus Table podcast. Join Dr. Nick Venditti, co-founder of Instead Global Bible College, and Eliott Reyna, youth pastor at Life Church Central, as we get to know Jesus through the Bible.
Welcome back to the Jesus Table podcast. We're so glad you're joining us. We are doing a deep dive today, starting a deep dive into what the temple is. And the reason we're doing this is because we want to give you guys a overview, a understanding of what these themes that are. Like we went through Pharisees, Sadducees, all that stuff, the Jewishness culturally of the Bible of this time period. And the temple is something that shows up all the time. And even for Christians who have been to church for decades, sometimes we can hear about the temple, but we don't really understand what it is, why it's so important. And I think understanding this will give weight to what later on passages will mention the temple, or it's brought up, or we understand motivations of different people and why they get so upset, or why certain things that Jesus says are so controversial and impactful. So we want to give a little bit more understanding of what the temple is. And this is something that shows up throughout the whole Bible almost, right,
Yeah.
Doc? So in the beginning, obviously, God's presence is with humanity in the garden. And then after they're cast out, it's not that God just disappears and is never seen again. He shows up in like very specific scenarios. And there's times where it almost seems like there's, I don't know what to call it. It'd be like a little place, a little special place of his presence,
Exactly.
like the burning bush, and
Right.
Moses has to take off his sandals, or Jacob, and he says, oh, the Lord is here, and he builds a little stone. So there's like these little instances of a holy place throughout the story. But then there's nothing like the tabernacle that's built, and then later the temple that replaces it. So Doc, why don't you give us a little understanding of why is that? What is this? What are these little holy places on earth, these little pockets of heaven that sort of show up, and why is the temple the biggest picture of that?
Well, I really like the phrase they use there, pockets of heaven, or samplings of heaven, or samplings of the presence of God. And what I'd like for us to do, and hopefully we'll do a series, maybe 2 or 3, regarding the temple because of the importance of it. And to some of us New Testament Christians, if I can use that phrase, we said, oh, the temple, that's something during Jesus's day, or that's something during the time of Nebuchadnezzar that he, and the Jews and exile, etc. But it has nothing to do with us. But I think it's important that we see the theme, because the temple really is the place for the presence of God. And let's not forget also at the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, chapters 21 and 22, it says there is no longer a temple, that it's a direct relationship with the presence of God. So if we understand the Bible from cover to cover of the importance of the presence of God and also the temple, I think it'll help us a lot to see why the temple was important and is important. Because Paul says, it's funny because in the New Testament, Paul calls the believers in the church the temple of God. So there is a thread, a biblical thread, both in the Old and the New Testaments regarding the temple that I think are very important for us to know about in the past, but also the present and the future.
Yeah, definitely. So to sort of kick us off, the tabernacle first shows up during the time where Moses is the leader, right? So what God tells him to do this, right? Like it's God's command to Moses, if I remember correctly. What's the purpose of it? Like why does God need the tabernacle? Because God at that moment has shown up in random spots like the burning bush, or on the Mount Sinai where Moses goes up and the cloud descends of his glory. Like, why build a tabernacle if we have a mountain? Why does God say, like, let's build something in the midst of your people? What do you think was the purpose originally of that?
Well, again, you're very insightful, and I appreciate the fact that you mentioned that God is not limited to the temple. As a matter of fact, when Solomon builds it, part of his prayer, he says, "Hey, you're the God of heaven. I know that a temple can't contain you. So it's not that God is limited to just the temple," which is a very important part of the theme of what we're discussing here. And God does show up in many and other ways, as you said, in the burning bush. In other times He shows up. But I think what's important for us to realize when we look at the Bible, we look at chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, and I've said this other times, but there's a total relationship of humanity, Adam and Eve, of course, and creation with God. There's a direct link, if you want to say that, with the presence of God and walking with God, and God is the creator. But then chapter 3, as we all well know, there's a separation from God, and God is the one that has the two angels after Adam and Eve sin, that won't allow anyone to come into the garden anymore. So really from chapter 3, 4 of Genesis all the way to the end of the Bible, we see the influence of sin, but sin doesn't overcome God's presence. And let me explain that a little. Yes, humanity sin. We see it in Adam and Eve, and we see it with Cain and Abel, and throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. But in the midst of all of that, the people, God's people, Israel, and also the new Israel, or the church, God always has a people, and He has a way of communicating. And you mentioned the tabernacle. The tabernacle, let's say, is the first place where God sort of promises that His presence would be there, would remain there. So, of course, the instructions for the tabernacle are very minute, and I know when we read them, we say, "Oh man, why is this important? What does this have to do?" And the colors, and the sizes, and all of those things. Well, there's a reason for it. We can't just look at those details exclusively. We have to understand the bigger picture, which again is the presence of God. And when we do the next series, we'll be looking at the tabernacle much more closely. And let us not forget that God was in the middle in the tabernacle, and the tribes, the people of God, were represented outside. So God is in the middle. I mean, that's what it portrays. God showing in the middle of His people. And this is all very strategic, and we don't want to get lost in the weeds either, because we can get a look at all these minute details. But it's important to realize that God promised that He would be with His people, and He would not leave and forsake His people. So that's why we see first the tabernacle, as you well mentioned, and after that, then we start seeing the temple. And we see the temple, David, with King David approximately 1,000 years before Jesus Christ came. But we see King David said that he wants to build a temple. And the prophet tells him, "Hey, that's a good thing, that's a good thing." But obviously then after the prophet, Nathan, if I remember correctly, said to him, "But yeah, God really doesn't want you to build a temple." So what David did was he prepared everything. In other words, he had the gold and the different things and the money needed for the temple. But God told him that his son, Solomon, which we know was the one that God picked or chose to build a temple. And of course, let's not forget that the tabernacle, wherever Israel moved, the tabernacle went with them. So God's presence was in the middle of His people, but yet Israel were not stationary. They were nomadic people until God promised again that they would be a nation, and they would be in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was a city of David, as we know, and it's also still around today. And that's why the temple, the stationary temple, was built. And God used Solomon, a great builder. We know that from history, a great builder. But everything from his father, let's put it like that, his desire to build a temple, we see how it was his son who fulfilled that. And it was, it's a great event. If you read 1 Kings chapter 7, especially in 8, and we're not going to go into that today, but you see the importance and how glorious the temple was, and the importance of the temple in the midst, and the prayer of Solomon, and how after he finishes praying and dedicating the temple, the presence of God comes in so great to the temple, that everybody had to leave. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
I mean, everybody just left because of the presence of God was so thick. So the temple became the national shrine, which is also very different from the other nations. Maybe we should even mention some of that,
Yeah.
because a temple wasn't limited to just Israel. They weren't the first ones on the block, sort of to say, that had a
Right.
temple. But there was a great difference between the temple that Israel made for the presence, and it was let's not forget there was only one temple, for Israel, where, for example, let's say the Macedonians, the Greeks, or the Romans, or just so many other cultures of that day, the Babylonians, they had many temples also, but they were to many different gods. They were polytheistic.
Right.
So, there's a major, major, major difference in all of this.
Yeah. Let's go a little bit more into that, because I think that's so key to understanding the ultimate purpose. You've talked about it represents God's presence with his people,
Right.
and that's so telling of the overarching narrative of the whole Bible, that it's God wanting to dwell with us, right?
Exactly.
And we've lost something that's been lost in the garden is to be restored. That's the promise. And so God could have stayed on the mountain with just meeting with Moses, but he's like, no, I want to get closer. And so he tabernacle, like you said, in the midst of his people, and it describes how, like, there was some tribes on the right, on the left, on north, on the south,
Exactly.
And so, like, they surrounded the tabernacle, and in the middle was the tabernacle, and in the middle of the tabernacle, we'll get more into that in our next episode, was the Ark of the Covenant, right, which was in the Holy of Holies. Like, there's this special presence of God there. But you mentioned sin, and I think that's key for people to understand. Like, why can't just anyone enter the temple? Why, like, we'll get into a little bit more of that. Like, why are there so many rules? Why did it have to be designed such a specific way? And like you said, there's a lot of detail given to it. A lot of it seems really like extra rules. Even for like the priests that are the only ones that can go in, etc. So why is it that there's this idea of sin and then God's presence and holiness, and it's like this radioactive, kind of thing? Like, if I were to explain it that way, like, it's not that God doesn't want to be with us, but rather that sin is not letting us.
Exactly.
And this would you say that this is different than how the other nations saw their temple, or did they have a similar idea of holiness?
Well, obviously, I would disagree for those that say, well, all the temples are the same. Very, very different. We know that, for example, some of the Greek temples, and some of the Roman temples, but some of the Greek temples especially, they had prostitutes. They had cults. So, sin was very rampant there. And depending on who you read, but not only female prostitutes, but also male prostitutes. So that's one of the things that right off the bat was very, very different. And there's that whole sense of holiness and righteousness that Israel had. You mentioned being on Mount Sinai before. If we remember correctly, when the Lord showed up and the mountain started shaking and they saw the fire and the smoke and all of that, the people were in awe. They were scared. They were literally scared. And they said, hey, Moses, you go talk to him. No, you can be our mediator, And it's a very, very different picture between the pagan cultures of the day, even before Jesus. A very, very different picture. And also, let us not forget, many of those gods were sort of half God and half human. They had human qualities. There wasn't that sense of righteousness and holiness of the God of Israel. So that to me is one of the major differences between the nations and their temples, and obviously the temple of Israel. And one of the uh, let me put it this way. I think one of the major problems that Israel had in their understanding of the temple, because it was unique. Well, I agree with that, but there was also the problem they became very prideful. Like, this is ours. We have the priests. The presence of God is with us, and excluded many times the nations. Their way of understanding God. And to be honest with you, in the book of Ezekiel, it mentions how the presence of God left the temple in chapter 10, if I remember correctly, of Ezekiel. So I mean, there was that whole thing of not understanding fully God's holiness, God's righteousness, the privilege of God being and dwelling in our midst, that Israel didn't follow. And, that's why the temple was burned in 586 with Nebuchadnezzar, and then rebuilt and reestablished, and then Herod in the first century at the time of Jesus. And we know finally that the temple, the physical temple, was destroyed in 70 AD. And even today, if you go to Israel and visit Israel, I've been there twice, but if you go today, the temple is no longer there. The temple wall is there, but not the temple per se. So, I mean, the theme of the temple is very, very important, not only in the Bible, but for us to understand.
Yeah, that's a good point. That I think there came times where they missed the purpose or the point of what the temple was. That the temple was not to be worshipped. The temple was just a place that represented God's presence, and not just represented, but that literally God's presence would fall there, like you said. And the tabernacle, it happened as well, where the cloud would come and not even the priest could come in there because it was just too holy, too much of His glory in there. So when they build the temple, that's whenever, like you said, first it was Saul, then David, and then Solomon. So, but Israel had recently become a kingdom with a king.
Right, exactly.
Before there was judges, and before it was just like a sort of
Tribes.
like a tribe, if you will. Yeah. And so now when they establish themselves more as a kingdom with Saul, and then really with David, with his reign, that he just like wipes out the Philistines basically, and then Solomon reigns with more peace, then the temple is built just like the tabernacle, I'd say, but just more grandiose, more better architecture, and more established, if you will.
And stationary. And it was stationary.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to tear it down and then, as they walk through the wilderness and then build it up again, the tabernacle. But I think then it became I don't know, would it be too harsh to say that the temple could become an idol to some of them? Do you
to
think
some
that
people it may sound harsh, but I think it's if we explain what you mean by that, or what we mean by that, it'll help someone to understand. Because Jeremiah, and also the major prophets talk about how the high priests were sinning within the temple. So I think it's very important that we realize that to some it was sort of an idol. Hey, it's our lucky charm. It's like, hey, God is in our midst. There's no reason for us to worry. We can do what we want because He continues to be our God, because He's in the temple, etc., etc. And there is that sense. You see it, especially in the book of Jeremiah. I would say that, when God sort of tells Jeremiah, "Hey, look within the temple," and we see that in the major prophets too.
Right. Because it's not that the temple was wrong, but we just as humans sometimes miss the point. I mean, in the scripture, I remember when God tells Moses to build a staff that looks like a snake, and whenever they get bit by a snake, they look at it, they're healed, and it's a good thing. It was a good
Hmm.
God-given thing, but eventually it became an idol. And then later
Exactly.
on, I forget how many years later, God tells someone, I forget who it was,
Hmm.
destroy it
Yeah.
because it's become an idol. Like
Yep.
these humans have put their focus on it. So we have a tendency to do that, and we sometimes
Hmm.
miss the ultimate point of something.
Hmm.
We focus on the means.
Hmm.
I had a professor who said sometimes we focus on the bus instead of the destination that the bus was trying to get us to, you know?
Good. Yeah.
And so, if anything, the temple was a way for God's presence to dwell with his
Right.
people, which eventually is the picture of Jesus, right? And John
Right.
chapter 1 tells us that Jesus tabernacled among us. That would be the Greek
Yeah.
word. And so like Jesus is there as the tabernacle. We'll get more into that later. But so okay, we've covered a little bit of God's presence. There's this idea of holiness, and it's that's what's stopping like
Hmm.
people from being able to be there. But that's God has made a way through these rituals, through these priests,
Hmm.
for his presence to still be with his people. um but whenever they missed the point, this temple was destroyed,
Right.
and his presence would leave. We've kind of covered how this temple is different from other ones, but this temple, without getting too much into the details, because I know we'll
Hmm.
get into that later, inside there was a lot of Eden imagery. There
Hmm.
was cherubims, which
Right.
were the ones guarding the entrance of Eden
Right.
whenever Adam and Eve were kicked out. There were these ideas of trees and
Hmm.
light. Why is that, Doc? Like, what is it about the temple that sort of reflects Eden?
Well, it's a going back to, I think when I mentioned before, the first two chapters of the Bible, there's no sin, and the last two chapters, there is no sin, and the whole idea is Christ as Redeemer, Christ as Savior is redeeming us, so that at the end, of course, after Christ's second coming, and when chapter 21 and 22 of the book of Revelation become a reality, it's a going back to the original relationship that we had with God, being reestablished. That remember, at the first two chapters of Genesis, there was no temple, and at the
Right.
last two chapters of the Bible, there is no temple. So to me, it's a great theme, throughout the Bible, seeing how sin is conquered, but also sin that separates us from God is conquered. We see it in Revelation chapter 20, where Satan and also death and everything that has caused and the influence of sin is thrown into eternal fire. But then we go back to the original state, which was God's
Mhm.
perfect intention for us. That we
Yeah.
have that open, no doors closed, if I can say, with our
Yeah.
relationship with God. And that's what I think is really fabulous about understanding the temple, the purpose, and the new temple.
Yeah. Definitely. And I'm thinking of Ezekiel when he has a vision of the temple,
Hmm.
and from this temple, there's four rivers that is coming
Hmm.
out, and that's what Eden is described as
Hmm.
in
Yep.
Genesis, that
Hmm.
there's a garden and there's four rivers that are coming
Hmm.
out. So there's this continuous theme image of the temple representing Eden, what we lost, like you said. And then at
Exactly.
the end of the story, there is no more temple because
Yeah.
God is their temple, it says in
Exactly.
Revelation. So
Exactly.
the temple, I guess, was a temporary
Hmm.
like promise, not more than a symbol, but like a presence of God
Yeah,
saying, I'm here, I'm coming for you,
that's
I'm
right.
going to restore things. And so it was such a holy thing.
Hmm.
And so hopefully this can get people thinking about like what this meant for the people of Israel, that this was
Right.
God with us. This meant he hasn't abandoned us, even though we
Right.
sometimes mess up, even though they fell into sin over and over again, rebellion and all this. But God is still with us. Here is the temple,
Exactly.
there is his presence.
Yep.
He hasn't abandoned us, he hasn't
Hmm.
forsaken us. And so whenever the temple was destroyed, it was a big deal. It was like, where is
Sure.
our God? Failed our
Yeah,
God? Lost against the Babylonian God?
that's
Or
right.
it was like their whole faith was destroyed
Sure.
in a sense, because this is where God dwells.
Yep.
So it was a big deal, and I think we sometimes don't really capture the
Hmm.
importance of it whenever we read the story and we're like, and then the temple was destroyed. Okay, no big deal. No, this was
Yeah,
humongous, like
yeah,
how God lost against
yeah.
this war. So I guess to one last question before we wrap up, uh, what would be, you think, the reason that God allowed the temple to be destroyed? You said like they were in rebellion
Yeah.
and all this, but there was always a promise that the temple would be rebuilt, right?
Hmm.
And so, was it in a way to teach them a lesson? Was it a way to sort of course correct Israel? I don't know what your thoughts
Yeah.
are on that.
I would say it's both. It was not only it was it was punishment, and we, of course, when we use the word punishment, some people are turned off automatically. Oh, punish! No, God is love, etc., etc. No, it was rebellion on behalf of the people, and it was course correction. Because when after Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came in. After that was when sort of Israel sort of caught the idea and understood, okay, there's only one God.
Yeah.
The whole sense of He's our God.
Right.
But that whole thing of course correction. If you want to use that term, that's fine. And you see
Right.
that later on, and we'll discuss this probably next episode. How the temple was not only a place, but it became more than a symbol.
Yeah.
And we will see that. I mean, for Jesus, and I'll end with this. When Jesus told the religious leaders in John chapter 2, you know, uh, where John tells us that he was talking about his temple. His body was the temple that he was going to
Yeah.
resurrect in 3 days, and we'll be looking at that probably next week or the following episode after that. But the importance of all of that, and Jesus highly regarded and respected the temple, and
Yeah.
we'll be looking at that. I
Yeah.
think with this we have enough to chew on.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Doc. Hopefully, this gives us a little introduction on these pictures and images and importance of purpose,
Yeah.
ultimately, of the temple. And our next episode, we're going to dive a little bit more into the details of it and what those details mean and historically what happened.
Hmm.
Sort of do a little bit more of an overview, and I think this is going to help a lot to understanding themes of the gospel, what things that happen with, like you said, later on in Matthew and John and the gospels of what Jesus did and said, and how this ultimately is a picture of Jesus and his presence with us. So thank you so much, Doc.
Great.
Hope this blesses everyone. And as you continue to know Jesus more through the Bible, we'll see you in our next episode.